Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. We'll be getting started in a couple of minutes, just letting a few more of our participants join before we dive into the content for today. Okay, we'll give it a 1 or 2 more minutes and then we'll get started. Okay, why don't we get started? Yeah, thank you so much for joining today. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to our first circular conversation. So this is a Q&A session following our webinar, Unleashing the Potential of the Circular Bioeconomy. So this webinar series is part of our larger research and engagement initiative called Pathway to the Pile, Exploring Compostable Futures. And through this initiative, we at the Waste Labs are aiming to advocate for the widespread use of bio-based and compostable products to facilitate greater organic waste diversion from landfill. And so with these engaging and informative webinars and conversations, we're going to be exploring the potential of organic waste streams and renewable biomass feedstocks as a tool within the circular bioeconomy. And our aim is really to educate participants, drive action, and identify gaps and opportunities for policy interventions in the Canadian landscape. So a little bit about the Waste Labs and myself. My name is Dr. Lavesia Chili. I'm the managing owner of Regenerative Waste Labs. Regenerative Waste Labs is a Vancouver-based circular bioeconomy research and consulting firm. We're really dedicated to tackling big problems and fostering systemic change within the circular bioeconomy. And through our data-driven approach, we really try to ensure that our clients have accurate insights and actionable information for decision-making. And we have a comprehensive suite of services to really help businesses create truly sustainable and regenerative products. So today, a little bit of housekeeping before we dive into our conversation. Today, we're going to be using Zoom, obviously, since we're all on Zoom together. In this session, it's really intended to be more of a conversation and discussion. We are picking up on the topics that were covered in our previous webinar, and we'll be bringing to the forefront key questions about the transition into the circular bioeconomy. So we really believe that learning is a two-way street. So as much as you'll hear from us, we really want to hear from you. So we're encouraging active participation. Please feel free to share where you're from and what projects you're working on in the chat box. We'll be continuing through this conversation today. So feel free to raise your hand if you want to add to the discussion. The chat box is always open, and you can always reach out to the Regenerative Waste Labs team who would have RWL in their name if you want to speak to them directly. The session will be recorded, and registrants will have access to the recording. If you don't want your comments featured in the recording, please send a message to myself or the RWL team. But yeah, please feel free to share in the chat box what brought you into the conversation today. We'd love to hear a little bit more about each of them. But before we get started, I want to take this moment to take a step back and really start this conversation by acknowledging the original keepers of this land. So today, although we're gathering virtually, spanning various distances and time zones, our connection to the land remains. So the Regenerative Waste Lab team works, lives, and plays on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And we pay respects to their ancestors, past, present, and future. And just as Indigenous communities have stewarded and respected the earth for generations, we too must work together to ensure the sustainability of our planet's resources. And as we're transitioning into this new economic paradigm, our journey is one of collaboration, where the paths of diverse stakeholders will converge for a shared purpose. So in the conversation ahead today, we really aim to spotlight not only the successes that illustrate what's achievable in the circular bioeconomy, but we also want to highlight the concerns and obstacles faced by those working towards this transformation. So today's conversation serves as both a continuation of the Regenerative Waste Labs' commitment to sustainability and community empowerment, as well as a tribute to the land and the Indigenous communities who have been stewards since time immemorial. And at the Waste Labs, like many Indigenous communities around the world, at Regenerative Waste Labs, we really look to nature to inspire the work that we do. And when we look at regeneration in natural systems, we see that this process of composting and creating something from waste is facilitated not by an individual, but more by an interconnected web of individuals and groups of organisms all coming together to make the ecosystem thrive. So in the same way, the Regenerative Waste Labs works to act as an innovation hub that connects stakeholders across the Canadian circular bioeconomy. We have strong partnerships with local businesses and organizations, and through this network, we facilitate the sharing of resources, information, and expertise within the circular bioeconomy. And the Waste Labs, we're leaders. We're leaders really trying to create this pathway for circular bioproducts. Through our research and consulting services, we support an ecosystem of innovators who are creating circular bioproducts and upcycling organic waste. We foster innovation by conducting product performance testing and environmental safety technical testing as well. And we consult for businesses, providing go-to-market support for innovators. We're really seeking to redefine waste and provide education and sustainability training, as well as working with waste producers to help them find avenues to upcycle waste. And finally, we're passionate about driving change. We do this by developing public education and awareness campaigns, by collaborating with other stakeholders to develop standards for circular economy and bio-based products. And Regenerative Waste Labs is not only an advocate for these systems, but we're committed to really to amplifying the voices of the stakeholders in our community through policy advocacy work. And that's really what the conversation here today is about, taking that next step from just kind of learning about circular bioeconomy to really addressing some of the key questions on how to fully implement a system. So we've received a great amount of questions from our previous webinar and also through the registration for this conversation today. And we saw that these fell into two main themes, cascading circular value and trying to find circular pathways. So we're going to start today's conversation with a quick recap of the circular bioeconomy framework or GAME that was mentioned that we talked about in our last webinar. And so this will give us a foundation to then talk about circular value chains and the policies to support their development. And we'll share some examples to start the conversation, but please feel free to raise your hand and contribute to this discussion. We really want to hear more of the pain points and the successes from those in the audience today. Okay, so let's get started. So just a quick recap of the circular bioeconomy GAME. So the intention of sharing this framework was really to create a model to showcase how the interconnectedness of different aspects of this system. As you can imagine, there's many different stakeholders, many different parts of an economy that need to come together to really drive sustainability. And so this model is intended to showcase how cooperation and competition can exist in a way that will drive sustainable outcomes. So the first part of our GAME is the playing field. The playing field represents the environment in which the game unfolds. So in this context, it may be a geographic region like a rural area or an urban space or the interspace between where they meet. And so the playing field is really the cradle that provides the resources needed to play the game. And it the playing field or the region or the locality of where our circular systems are being implemented really impacts the types of systems that can come out of this new type of economy. Next, we have the players. So the players are a diverse group of entities representing public or private organizations or individuals involved in the circular bioeconomy. So these players form partnerships. They can range from public-private partnerships to cooperatives, to industrial clusters, to just a cohesive value chain. So each player within these different partnerships brings unique skills and resources to the game and allows different types of moves and outcomes to evolve. Next, we have the game pieces. So the game pieces are the resources themselves. These can be things like organic waste or agricultural residues or byproducts from the agri-food supply chain. We can also have kind of less traditional waste streams, like, for example, dog hair, human hair. There's so many different organic waste streams, and all of these can be included within this game. And so these different resources or pieces are moved around strategically by the different players as they're making their various moves. Let's talk about the moves. The moves are really how this organic waste goes from place to place and the processes that are used to extract additional value. So these moves can be things like organizational structures or technological innovations, things like resource handling, processing, distribution, recycling. Within these moves, players engage in activities, and those activities then lead to outcomes, and those outcomes can either be sustainable or unsustainable. So it's really, the moves are all about how that material and how those resources, game pieces, move from place to place. And next we have the rules. So the rules are really the laws, regulations, and incentives, the enablers and barriers, which determine what moves or steps a player or a new business model can take within the emerging circular bioeconomy. So some of the enablers that we mentioned in our last conversation are things like geographical proximity. So how close are these different players to each other, and how can that support and facilitate the movement of this organic waste? Other enablers are local cooperation, industrial support, consumer behavior, and environmental trends. So all of the things which really enable all of these new business models to come into fruition. On the other hand, we have barriers. So barriers could be things like technical or logistical challenges, economic or financial factors such as market access, infrastructure, things like hygiene and safety concerns, and regulatory constraints. The barriers are things which are currently limiting the broader expansion of the circular bioeconomy. And really the rules and the policies which come into place are trying to create a shift from barriers into enablers. So how can we really turn that table to make it easier and more less costly for businesses to really step into this new system? And finally, the outcome. So as I mentioned, every move that a player makes as we're creating and transforming this organic waste is creating different valuable products. These products can be things like fertilizers, ingredients, biomaterials, and other bio-based products. These are the inventive and innovative creations that add excitement and value to the game. So ultimately, as players make their moves and as these outcomes come to play, these outcomes are either sustainable or unsustainable for the players themselves, for their business model, or for the circular bioeconomy as a whole. And so as the game's dynamics emerge, as these business models continue to pilot and scale, we're going to see a series of adaptations over time. And these adaptations really are due to the feedback and feed forward between players and different aspects of the supply chain. And so this just really shows the dynamic nature of the circular bioeconomy, the fluctuality of, as we're creating these complex systems, we need to make sure that things like policies and rules are changing and shifting to really facilitate the broader enabling of these systems as well. And just like in any game, the circular bioeconomy requires strategic thinking. It may not be possible today because of technological limitations to be able to extract certain amounts of value, but how can we start to set the policy frameworks, How can we start to be planning our business models to really start to be addressing and extracting those opportunities as they come? And so by understanding the rules and collaborating with other players within our supply chain, by making innovative moves, we can start to contribute to a sustainable and thriving circular bioeconomy system. So based on the questions that we received today, this conversation will be focusing on the moves, the rules, and the outcomes, and the interplay and interconnectedness between those three aspects of the circular bioeconomy. In follow-up conversations, we'll be starting to look at other aspects like the interplay between rules, players, and some of the game pieces. So how those different organic waste streams might be able to be utilized and harnessed in different ways. But to start off with, let's kind of shift gears from our circular bioeconomy framework and start talking a little bit more about cascading circular value. So two of the questions, kind of the overarching questions that we got about circular value were, how can we collect organic waste in a way that makes the most value out of it? And also, can we share some examples of how upcycling processes lead to enhanced circularity? And furthermore, we had a couple of, additional questions within these veins. How does the concept of circular bioeconomy differentiate from things like whole food utilization, for example? And how can we balance the impact of material transportation with the benefits gained of reusing materials in circular? So to answer these questions, we need to take a closer look at this idea of cascading. So the goal of cascading is to really start to utilize, to increase the resource efficiency of organic waste and limit the demand for primary materials. And so the circular bioeconomy really expands on the traditional waste hierarchy to provide additional opportunities to divert organic waste and create value-added products before the generation of bioenergy and biofuel. We'll talk a little bit about that in the conversation. Forward. So yes, just a reminder, please feel free to raise your hand if you want to add any thoughts to the discussion and continue to add your thoughts in the chat. But yes, okay, so let's start talking about circular value. But before we do, let's take a step back and start to recognize that every circular system needs to start with reduce as our primary motivating factor. So we need to be really thinking about how we can stop waste from happening in the first place. And I think this is a key point to raise up because when we're looking at circular systems for organic, for organic waste, we see a lot of competing viewpoints within when we're talking about circular food systems. I wanted to address this now. So when we're thinking about utilizing organic waste, we need to recognize that we should be reducing avoidable food loss and food waste. So there's lots of, within our current food system, there's lots of places for food to be leaking out. And it's really, we can greatly reduce both the social and environmental impacts of this food system by really ensuring that we're properly redirecting usable food to people who can use it. So I just wanted to bring up a couple of examples of this. So Food Stash is a local organization here in Vancouver, and they are rescuing food from different organizations like supermarkets. And so Food Stash Foundation is a nonprofit that delivers food to participants in their program, people who have barriers to accessing food services. And so here's an opportunity to be taking food waste that can still be used and directing it to people who can actually utilize it. Another system with another organization within this food loss and food waste, this food justice and food security kind of space, is Food Mesh. So Food Mesh develops a software platform that's used to facilitate the collection and redistribution of recovered food. So you can imagine if you have a grocery store with a large amount of organic waste, which is just, for example, just past its use by date, it's important to be able to direct that food to different organizations like soup kitchens and things like that, who can utilize that food waste stream as effectively and as quickly as possible before it rots and is unusable for human consumption. And so what we can learn from these organizations, which are really looking at food security and food justice, and this work should be done tangentially to developing a circular bioeconomy for unavoidable food waste. And so what we can learn from these organizations are the examples of low impact transportation. So Food Stash, because they're collecting food from a very localized supply chain, they are using a diversity of low emission transportations in their operation. So they use things like e-bikes and car share programs and low emission vehicles. And they've recently partnered with Fresh Prep as a delivery vendor. So Fresh Prep, they deliver packaged food to people to kind of make it in their homes. So Fresh Prep and Food Stash have coupled together to facilitate the delivery to the people with barriers to food access, at the same time as delivering to customers of Fresh Prep. So using one delivery supply chain to really be connecting people with food who really need to access that food. So these organizations are using examples of low emission vehicles and technology to really facilitate the transfer of organic waste. And so within this idea, the circular bioeconomy is intended to utilize secondary and tertiary biomass to avoid competing with food and other primary uses of biomass. So secondary biomass are bioproducts from bioresource production. You can think about the gas from sugarcane production, manure from dairy farms, waste from paper mills. So the waste that's created from the creation of primary resources. Whereas tertiary biomass is the biomass, is the waste obtained after use. So we can think about the slurry from anaerobic digestion and post-consumer organic waste. And the circular bioeconomy centers itself on these waste streams so that we can ensure that food is being given to people who can actually use it. So when we're actually thinking about, now we're kind of taking a side step from the reduce piece and looking more closely at the circular bioeconomy aspects. We want to talk a little bit about the level 1 cascade. So the initial cascade, which is reuse and mechanical recycling. So reuse could be things like there's the company which is making onion rings. And so to make onion rings, you have to chop the tops and the bottoms of the onions, and then you make your onion rings. So a reuse option for organic waste could be taking those ends of the onion, drying them out, grinding them to make onion powder. And so that's a mechanism in which we're utilizing, we're reusing the onions as an ingredient for further use. And so one example within the Canadian landscape of reusing organic waste comes from the Repurpose Incubator. So the Repurpose Incubator is an incubator that provides food and beverage companies access to find a pathway to ingredients and product commercialization for their unavoidable food waste. And they have this great kind of model that they created, which was creating a circular meal. So what they ended up doing was they coupled 7 different companies to try within a framework to create a circular meal. And they started off with a brewery who had spent brewery grain. That spent brewery grain went to an insect, I think it was a black soldier fly farm. So the brewery grains were used to feed the insects. Those insects were then used to feed fish. The fish waste was then used to as an organic fertilizer at a potato farm. And so here you have one waste stream feeding into various other different systems to create insects, fish, and potatoes. The sprint brewery grains were also used to make baked goods in a different relationship. So now you have fish, potatoes, and bread, and all of those different food stocks came together at a restaurant, and they made a sourdough crusted fish and chips meal from all of these different systems. So that's just one way to really showcase where how these waste streams can be used within a food supply chain to really facilitate greater waste diversion and to minimize the use of virgin feedstocks throughout that supply chain. So another example of a level 1 cascade is mechanical recycling. So mechanical recycling is really about maintaining the physical properties of that material. We can think about, for example, grinding shellfish shells to form an aggregate for biocrete. And here's another example, which is from an organization called Chop Value, and they started here in Vancouver. So Chop Value, they collect used chopsticks from different types of Asian food restaurants across the city. They collect those chopsticks and then they convert them into beautiful products, both furniture and other types of products as well. And so here's an example of taking organic waste, processing it in some way to maintain the physical properties of that waste and create a product alongside of it. And so this is what we call level one cascade, where we're utilizing the all of the entire physical structure of that organic waste stream in another product or another ingredient for within that supply chain. So now we can move to a level two cascade. So a level two cascade is advanced recycling. So advanced recycling is really about extracting compounds and components from organic waste in a way that directly feeds back into the production loop. And two examples to highlight here. One is InnoFiber, an organization out of Quebec. So they're providing technical services to facilitate the use of biomass. So they work with a whole variety of different biomass streams. As an organization who creates organic waste, you can work with them and they will help you condition and pre-treat your biomass. They also provide access to things like microalgae and other types of biomass resources for innovators to use within their own production. And there's another company out of Nova Scotia called Aruna Health, and they're utilizing both food and crop waste in their compostable products. So they're diverting food and crop streams, they're processing that material to form the different aspects of their compostable products. So I want to take a moment. I do see that there's Andrew Tate in the room today. And Andrew, if you feel comfortable, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your project. I know that you work a lot with some of these different organic compounds that are extracted from waste streams. If you don't mind, I'm kind of picking on you at the moment. If you don't mind adding to the conversation, please feel free to unmute if you would like, or you can drop your thoughts in the chat box.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Jolie, thank you so much. This has been very informative, and I'm constantly learning so much, almost on a daily basis, about the circular economy. So when we started the business, we were essentially a drug development company. So at Tate Labs, we were making compounds that were to be developed further for treatment for multiple sclerosis. And it had nothing to do with the circular economy. And at the time when we started, it was 12 years ago. And circular economy wasn't even part of common vernacular. And so it just so happened that the compounds we were interested in were from citrus peel. And so having conversations with a variety of stakeholders to understand how we could get the source material, to process that material, it really didn't have the current hot allure that the circular economy has. I mean, if for I guess the sake of value creation, it just wasn't really a thought really for the mainstream that we would have this really urgent need to find circular mechanism. So again, Dr. Chile, I really appreciate your articulation today, and I know you have other resources available, and you've been on different podcasts and so on. But yeah, a lot of what you're saying in hindsight is describing the activities that we have carried out from understanding, where we get the orange peel from. Typically, it comes from orange juice manufacturers. Where does that happen? I mean, most people think it's from Florida. Historically, Florida was the #1 producer of orange juice, but since it's moved to Brazil as the #1 orange juice producer in the world, second is Mexico. So to understand the full cascade of the waste streams, like where does the waste currently go, a lot of it goes to landfill, a lot of it goes to feed cattle. And so that's a whole other problem with greenhouse gas emission, erosion of the Amazon. The orange juice companies claim that they're not producing waste, and that may be true, but it's feeding a secondary problem. So again, thank you for really, I'd say, elegantly articulating all these different levels of the bioeconomy. So so yeah, that's what we're doing at Tate Labs in terms of upcycling and our part of the circular economy. One final thing I think I neglected to mention is that we're no longer developing drugs. We've since pivoted to a more accessible market, which is ingredient development. So the same compounds that we were originally interested in for developing into drugs are now sort of repositioned as food ingredients, food, beverage, nutraceutical, pharmaceutical. So that's what we're about.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing, Andrew. Yeah, we have a meeting scheduled soon, and I'd love to chat with you more. But I think that's exactly right. I feel these ideas of circular economy, circular bioeconomy aren't necessarily new, but I believe that it's because there's no broader regulatory framework to support and facilitate a deeper, a broader kind of transition into this type of system, then we see a lot of organizations like yours really kind of going at it alone and not having that regulatory support to really facilitate and foster those connections within the broader supply chain. And you're exactly right. Like you've highlighted kind of the externalities. I guess we can look at them at, I think it's like phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 environmental impacts. And so I think this talks a little bit about the nuances within the circular economy as well. And we'll talk about this in just a moment. But how do you decide between your circular loops? As you've mentioned, some of those orange peels go to cattle farms to feed cattle. And how do you prioritize where that organic material can go? And so in that specific example, we know that, yes, cows are farting. I'm from New Zealand, and we have this the fart tax for dairy farmers, which is very controversial, where dairy farms are emitting a lot of methane. But we also know that there are some food stocks, like things like microalgae, which we can feed to cows, which will actually reduce the amount of methane that they generate when they are consuming and excreting different things. So there's a lot of externalities there. And what we really want to talk a little bit about as we move through this conversation is how can we really start to facilitate a broader policy pathway that's going to actually address these externalities, but also highlight and emphasize the opportunities within the circular bioeconomy for creating really innovative ingredients and components and compounds, as you've mentioned, for a variety of different industries. And you can really extract so much added value from waste and multiple different streams as well. And so the previous example, which I shared about how spent brewery grains can go to so many different places and be utilized in so many different ways. And really, at the end of the day, we want to be diversifying as much as possible where these different waste streams can go. So that we're also looking at things like material agnostic technology. So if we can extract, for example, cellulose, chitosan, or other types of bioactive compounds like I'm thinking about polyaromatics, polyphenols as well, other types of bioactive compounds. If we can extract those from a variety of different waste streams rather than just one specific waste stream, then we're going to be starting to build a more resilient chemical industry as well in the long term. So it's really exciting to hear about your innovation, Andrew. Thank you so much for sharing. I also wanted to highlight a couple of other different projects that we've heard about. There's the Shell project, which is looking at taking eggshells to make bio-based calcium, which I think is super cool. And another organization called Infinite Harvest, which is looking at different opportunities for black soldier flies as well. So we can see the flies themselves, the larvae, there's even through the production of insects, there's so many different waste streams and different material streams that you can utilize in various different ways. Okay, but let's get moving through the conversation for today. So we also have level 3 cascades. So a level 3 cascade is really all about carbon recovery. I think in the conversation at the moment, we're compiling everything into this one idea of recovery, and we really believe at the Waste Labs it's important to differentiate some of these. So recovery is just simply taking that carbon and indirectly feeding it back into the loop. So that could either be energy recovery, where we're converting materials into renewable energy sources like biofuels, like biogas, and biochar. It can also be organic recovery, where we're converting materials into ecological beneficial products like compost and biofertilizers. So a couple of examples of that. One, a very kind of traditional example, I guess we can say, would be the City of Surrey's biofuel facility. So they are creating bioenergy and compost from municipal organic waste. And so they have a large anaerobic digestion facility that's coupled with a compost operation that manages the digestate or the slurry that's left over after the biofuel formation. There's also an organization out of Nova Scotia called Sustain, and so they're taking biomass from they're taking municipal organic waste and they're extracting different streams from that material. They're extracting a biomass to make fuel pellets and they're creating synthetic diesel from the different waste streams as well. And they're selling those products to industrial customers as a substitute for virgin fossil resources. So once again, I think it goes back to kind of some of the indigenous and the traditional thinking about how can use the whole cow or how can use the whole mammoth. Every aspect of the waste stream that we create can be used in different ways. And if we're incorporating circular cascading opportunities, then we can actually extract multiple different things throughout the life cycle and the value chain of that waste stream. And we often depict these waste streams as, circles, still very two-dimensional, because it's hard for us to conceptualize that there's actually quite a few different connections. There's a few different ways that we can feed this organic waste throughout these different systems. And so just to touch on what we mentioned previously, how can we decide between these different cascading uses? So the intention of cascading is to maximize value, but deciding between how we maximize that value is really governed by a variety of different factors. And essentially, the challenge really becomes is that every waste stream is different, and because organic waste is, microbially susceptible to microbial degradation, it's also very temporal as well. And so speed is required. And so that's where organizations like InnoFiber are really innovative, because they are facilitating the pre-treatment of that organic waste to allow for that material to actually be to reduce its its microbial activity, to facilitate its ability to be transported more broadly. And so, kind of high level, just thinking about the conceptualizing the different aspects of deciding between different cascading uses, the waste composition in itself is a key factor. So certain organic waste streams may be better suited for certain processes than others. So for example, we had dry wood waste from deconstruction or as a byproduct of different types of forestry operations. It's dry, it's not very active, there's not much nitrogen in it, it can be transported around. So if we're thinking about wet, soggy, mixed municipal organic waste, there's only so many places that we can take that material before it starts to get very, very active, very hot as well, because of those microbes. They're really going to be producing a lot of heat and very smelly. And so those are factors that need to be considered when we're thinking about how we're going to transport that material around. There's also, quite obviously, perhaps the value of the potential product. So some waste streams may have higher potential value. So as Andrew was saying, like orange peels have so many bioactive compounds and things like fragrances and so many things in their peels. But you need to have a relatively uniform stream. Like you can't have your orange peels mixed with apple cores and other types of things. So the homogeneous nature of waste streams is also really important to identify the value of the potential product. We also have the technological capacity. So we may not have the technological readiness or the feasibility of the technologies available to us in different places. So we know that, for example, in the Canadian prairies, we don't have as much there's not as robust of an innovation landscape there. So there may not be as many technologies to actually do this conversion in some jurisdictions over others. There's also economic feasibility. If the only technology that you can find is 2 provinces over, we need to be considering both the environmental and economic impacts of transporting materials those long distances. And also the fact that as we move from level 1 to 2 to 3 through our cascades, and thinking about the reduce aspect as well, each of those subsequent levels does have a higher environmental impact, because you have to put more energy, more effort into doing things like grinding, reprocessing, extracting, burning and recovery in different ways. So we do have to also recognize that as we move down each level, there will be a higher impact, but then just balancing that impact based on if we're localizing that processing, if we're really creating a very high value end product, if the organization itself is aligning with the appropriate ESG goals. There's so many competing factors that are required to really start to decide between these cascading uses. And so when we look at the policy landscape, we also don't really necessarily see too many of these considerations coming into light when different regulators are creating the landscape to really facilitate the transfer of this material around. So I guess I'll pause there and just take a look at our chat box if there's any comments. I see that Lewis, sorry, I pronounced that incorrectly. Infinite harvest technology is wonderful. Great to see you in the chat room here. We use circular economy principles to process organic waste and turn them into valuable protein products using insects and biofertilizers. We measure the carbon offsets generated by our processes as compared to transporting, processing, and disposing waste in landfill. Fantastic. And we do this in decentralized units that are installed where waste is generated. So, Louise, you've touched on many things that we've talked about. If you feel comfortable, please feel free to unmute yourself to talk a little bit more about your project. I'll just give you that opportunity now.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I'm outside, so I don't bring on my camera. But no happy to share a little bit about what we're doing. Yeah, and you have mentioned a few of the challenges that we see in the industry, and processing organic waste using insects is not a new concept. But one of the main challenges that I see, and you have touched on some of these points, is the transportation and the economic feasibility of transporting this organic waste. When we look at organic waste, it's probably 70-80% water, and transporting water, is not a very smart decision from our point of view. So what we decided to do was to design a more suitable within the current supply chain for organic waste, and bring the actual processing of the waste to the sites where it's being produced. So, you talk about the potato peels, for example. So if the potato peels are being, processed in a factory, we can actually bring a container unit with our insect processing system inside and process it there. And we only, transport at the end of our processing time, the protein, which is high value, high value product. So, even though there may be some inconsistencies in the protein profile of the insects that we produce because of the different waste streams that we have, we believe that the industry overall benefits because it's having a average protein level for the insects will be as valuable as having a super consistent process and super consistent protein. So anyway, that's what we're doing in our company, and we are also analyzing some of the working with certain organizations in the research side to see how insects can actually bioconvert or extract some of the toxins that you may find in some grains and food that insects by themselves can actually remove and don't transfer to the food supply chain when they're used either as a protein for animals and some other things. And of course, the fertilizer that we produce at the end of the process is pretty valuable as well. So anyway, overall, we like to see ourselves as a zero waste process, although the energy that we use, maybe producing some waste and some emissions in the environment. But for our direct process, that's what we do. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing. I really, what you've said about, I guess, decentralized technology really resonates with me, because that's also what that's something that the Waste Lab is really interested in looking at as well. Because I mean, when you look at our broader waste systems, it's very centralized, it's very clunky. One truck goes to multiple different places, brings it all back to a centralized location and processes it all there. And I think anyone who's walked beside or behind a garbage truck knows how stinky and like unpleasant it is to be around those trucks. And that's simply because organic waste is smelly, that rots quickly, and it can quickly become less valuable over time. And so one of the opportunities, I think, with the circular bioeconomy, as what you've said quite rightly, Louise, is to focus on the fact that we need local solutions. If we can process waste on site, we can, as you said, we can reduce that moisture content, we can transport a light and more valuable material around, rather than transporting heavy and less valuable material around. So there's so many interesting opportunities there. We see quite a few different organizations really focusing on creating technologies like that. We have one of our sister companies here in Vancouver, Terraformer Systems, which is making on-site organic processing technologies. We see a lot of different, mostly for, I guess, organics processing, because that's one of the more challenging materials to utilize. But creating decentralized local systems by creating localized supply chains also builds resilience, especially in the face of climate change. As we've seen, like I think it was maybe 2 years ago now, a sideways boat kind of just like disrupted global transportation for weeks. And that is not the sign of a robust and resilient system. So if we can start to localize the production of both our products and our feedstocks and our ingredients, we can really start to make sure that when the climate change does impact our systems, our global systems more for longer periods of time, that locally we still are able to actually access the food and the different types of resources and technologies that we need. So it's very cool to see an innovation like yours, Louise, which is really focusing on that decentralized and distributed network. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I think that's a great segue to kind of the next aspect of our conversation, which is shifting gears and talking a little bit about policy pathways. So some of the questions that came up, or the overarching questions, were what policies and financing strategies is Canada adopting to support circular bioeconomy projects? And how are companies and market players collaborating with policymakers to ensure their products are properly managed after use? So in this aspect, we're really going to be talking a little bit about the interplay between the rules and the moves of the circular bioeconomy system. How are the rules really facilitating the broader movements of these different organic waste streams? And so, yes, so we've, this is definitely not an exhaustive list, but we have identified and highlighted some really exciting and promising pilot programs. We have Guelph and Wellington's, that region has their Our Food Future, and they've also developed the Circular Opportunity Innovation Launchpad, or COIL. And so COIL was really exciting. It had multiple different initiatives, from the repurpose initiative that we mentioned previously to many other ways of kind of incorporating circular economy into different businesses in that region. And so we also see places like the Synergy Foundation here in British Columbia, which is supporting circular economy businesses through incubators such as Project Zero, which is focused specifically on helping circular economy businesses to scale and grow. And they also have the BC Green Business Certification to allow businesses to actually start to quantify and validate the work that they're doing within the circular economy. And we're also seeing CFIN, which is the Canadian Food Innovation Network. They have some amazing food technology grants for those in the agri-supply chain, really fostering innovation. So what we're seeing and what we're needing is to move from inventing groundbreaking solutions to fostering innovation. And the way that we move from inventions to innovation is really through through implementation. So finding ways to make sure that that invention is being properly implemented. So looking at the social impacts, the economic, the environmental, the policy and regulations, to really facilitate that innovation, really supporting our communities and allowing us to really start to transition. However, what we also see in the landscape are the barriers. So the challenges, and these are things like policy contradictions, funding gaps, and limited definitions for novel materials. So one of the things I wanted to highlight is we have many federal and provincial programs funding compostable and bio-based materials, but on the other side, we don't have any distinction, we don't have any definitions that are defined, making a distinction between petroleum-based and plastic-based and bio-based plastics and policies. We also see contradictions in the fact that compostable single-use items are being banned alongside with other types of primary plastic products, despite the fact that we're investing millions of dollars in forming and creating bio-based materials. So it's this contradiction between the funding mechanisms and the actual policies being put in place. There's also a lack of clear wording for biocomposite materials and bio-based feedstocks as well. We know where there's innovations in things like hemp or fiber biopolymer blends, compressed fibers, different types of bio-based foams, bio-based textiles, even using mycelium as different types of packaging. So none of those biocomposite materials are being defined in any of the policies that we see around plastics and other types of materials. And so this is really showcasing that there's a need for long-term support. There's this assumption that by funding things like invention and acceleration and different types of models like that, that when that product gets to commercialization, that there'll be people willing and ready to purchase those materials. But I'm sure everyone on this call recognizes that there's a lot of costs, both environmental and economic, which goes into making sustainable products. And that cost needs to be passed on to the customer. And so without this longer term support for procurement and other types of mechanisms or incentives, we end up getting to a place where we've supported the invention, but we're not supporting the implementation of these products. And we see a lot of these pilot programs from different regions and organizations, but they're not being transformed into long-term ongoing support for businesses. And so we're seeing that that's leading to a very challenging landscape. But we look to other jurisdictions, and there's been a lot of work being done in the European Union. There's an amazing program called Horizon Europe, which is a research and innovation funding program. The program has allocated 95.5 billion euros from 2021 to 2027 to tackle climate change and help the EU achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so through this massive program, there's been so many amazing initiatives being funded. There's Tech for Biowaste, which is a free online Wikipedia-style database for biowaste conversion technologies. The team will drop some of these in the chat box for those who are interested. So that's Tech for Biowaste. We also have the Bio-based Nanomaterials, Polymers, and Nanocomposites program, or BioMac. So this is a research and industrial community that's serving the uptake of these revolutionary technologies. The intention of this initiative is to really allocate funding to support both research and innovation and implementation that's integral for developing resilient circular bioeconomy processes. So the difference that we're seeing in the Canadian landscape versus some of the work that's being done in other jurisdictions like the EU, that we don't necessarily have these longer term funding buckets that are available for innovators. Everything is very short, between 1 and 2 years, and it's kind of like hit it quickly and then that's pretty much it. So what we're really advocating for is really a more thoughtful and longer term policy and funding framework to really facilitate both invention and implementation through not necessarily just pilots, but longer term incorporation of these new technologies into our broader marketplaces and our systems. And so some of the policies that we're seeing that could enable some of this work, we'll just take a step back and go to the example of compostable bioproducts, because that's where a lot of the work that the Waste Labs is centered in, is really just the fact, we're needing policies to drive circular recovery. And so although we have regulators across the country really recognizing that we need to have greater diversion of waste from the landfill, we're not necessarily seeing that support coming through in the policies and the incentives to actually help to divert that material. So we're seeing that some enablers could be just really relatively simple. Like when we're thinking about compostable products, if we only have distinctions for 2 or 3 types of facilities that take leaf and yard waste, food waste, or biosolids, what would be it would be relatively simple, or relatively simple to implement an additional composting permit class that would provide standard conditions and reporting requirements for operators who want to take compostable products. It would also provide a mechanism for municipalities to actually ensure through their procurement processes that their compost vendors actually can process compostable products. And it will also start to create a level playing field for compostable bioproducts as well. So at the moment, when we look at the life cycle analysis of compostable products, if those materials do not end up in a compost facility, they're going to be they're going to have a larger environmental impact if they're in a landfill. But at the moment, if we cannot get those compostable products into the compost facility, then we're kind of at this crossroads where even though we're innovating products that will directly support waste diversion, we're not actually allowing those products to support waste diversion. So that's kind of where some of these policy contradictions come into play. And we can see that in other different jurisdictions as well, or other industries as well. So for example, we have bio-based materials as building composites, but we know that for safety reasons, which are obviously important, that it takes a long time for new materials to be used in the construction of new buildings. But how can we start to create a policy framework coupled with a research framework that will facilitate the faster transition of these new types of materials into these different industries? And so at the moment, we're not really seeing those contradictions really being addressed and alleviated when we're thinking quite broadly about these different opportunities. So I'll just turn quickly to the chat box and see if any of the participants have any comments around some of the policies that would really enable greater participation within the circular bioeconomy for them. I see that we have Michael in the room. I'm not sure where you're from, Michael, but if you feel free to sharing, please feel free to unmute. And Andrew and Louise also, please feel free I'll just pause here to see if you'd like to share.
Hi, my name's Mike Che. I'm with the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology up in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I'm just happy to listen and get as much information as possible. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks for joining us, Mike. Appreciate that. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody else with their hands raised, so I'll keep moving through. We are coming up on time. So I get very excited talking about these topics. So really, I guess I'll just skip ahead so I guess at the end of the day, we're really advocating for a balanced approach to policy. So the circular bioeconomy can really be the binder, which is really supporting a lot of various Canadian commitments aimed generally at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But if we implement a circular bioeconomy, this will really mean prioritizing the use of renewable and recycled carbon, safe and benign products, reuse, recycling, and organic recovery pathways, as well as spreading widespread adoption and production of renewable energy in a decentralized way, which will really provide more robust opportunities within the Canadian landscape as a whole. So that kind of wraps up kind of the high-level key questions that we had from this initial webinar. Please feel free to drop your key takeaways in the chat box, but I'll keep moving through in the interest of time. I also just wanted to share a little bit about how the participants may be able to get involved in some of the advocacy work that's being driven by the Regenerative Waste Labs. We are implementing a collaborative research and engagement project called Pathway to the Power of Exploring Compostable Futures. And this is a project to really drive acceptance and collection of the acceptance and collection infrastructure for compostable bioproducts. The first aspect of this initiative is an engagement project, which these conversations and these knowledge sharing webinars are part of that. And we're also going to be moving through stakeholder roundtable discussions to really provide an inclusive platform for collaboration from the various stakeholders within the supply chain. We also have our research project, Compostable Futures. We're working with the City of Vancouver to develop a dedicated research site, which will allow for the Waste Labs team to expand our evaluation of the performance and environmental impacts of compostable products. So this will be a platform for researchers, policymakers, and the public to all observe the composting process, engage in discussions, and witness the positive outcomes of compostable materials in real-world settings. So please feel free to reach out to our team to learn more information about these different partnership opportunities. But I guess I just wanted to wrap up to share that this is not the last conversation that we'll have. Coming up at the end of September, we'll have our next circular conversation. We'll be bringing in, we'll be talking about the intersection between the different players or business models that emerge out of circular bioeconomy, the different moves and technologies that are available, and also focusing a little bit more on the different types of organic waste streams. And so we'll be speaking to a couple of organizations within our, we'll be highlighting and spotlighting a couple of organizations within our network. If you'd like to join that conversation to share more about your project, please feel free to reach out to me and the team. And we'll have a couple more of our knowledge sharing webinars from in October and early next year. Next conversation will be talking about compostable alternatives and how we can drive climate action through landfill diversion. But yeah, that wraps us up for today. We kind of zoomed through that webinar, but thank you all so much for joining us. Please feel free to reach out through our website or through our email for additional information. If you have any final thoughts, please drop them in the chat box. But other than that, have a great rest of your day, and we will talk to you all soon.